So we're going to move on to the next session. And the first talk really focuses on the public. And we've already heard about the importance of patient involvement, public engagement in this area. And so I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Joyce Tait who's the director of the Hinxton Institute in Edinburgh, who's going to tell us about public perceptions of stratified medicine from the work that they've done through TSB before, prior.
Okay, thank you very much for this invitation. I think I'm here because I was a member of the advisory committee for the TSB, the then TSB, now Innovate UK, public dialogue on stratified medicine. And just to give you a little flavour of what the Hinxton Institute does, we're actually, as far as I'm aware, and I'd be interested to hear of any competitors, we are absolutely unique internationally in looking at innovation, particularly in life sciences, in all those areas on the left, from three different perspectives: from the perspectives of the innovators, from the perspectives of governance and regulation, and from the perspectives of stakeholders and public members of the public, and how these three perspectives interact with one another to determine what innovation actually reaches the marketplace at the end of the day. And that gives us the capacity, I think, which I'll come to towards the end of my talk, to locate the stakeholder perspective in the wider perspective in how it impacts on innovation and regulation and governance. The problems with stakeholder engagement, we've done quite a lot of stakeholder engagement. I came to this initially from the perspective of GM crops in Europe beginning in the 1980s. So as you can tell just by looking, I've been around for quite a long time. And I've been involved with these things right from the beginning of their emergence in the life sciences. And when the upstream engagement trajectory came on stream in the UK, heavily supported by the research councils, I was aware of a lot of the challenges that would raise that other people weren't aware of. And really it's around things like groupthink. If you take something at a very early stage in the development of an innovation, the views of small groups will be easily persuaded by those with strong opinions. So you'll get the small groups actually framing the new technology in the minds of the public rather than reflecting what the public already thinks about it. And if you allow these small group discussions to be led by people who've already got an anti-innovation agenda, as we did with GM crops, you will inevitably support the development of anti-technology opinions in the wider community. And that's what happened with GM crops. So when TSB said we're going to do public engagement around stratified medicine, my initial reaction was, oh dear. But I must admit, having been involved in it, it was actually one of the best exercises in public engagement I've been aware of. And I think it worked really well. So there are a whole range of things like recruitment bias, conflict of objectives, the topic that you focus on, if it's too broad, it's meaningless to the public. You're getting engagement fatigue. Everybody's fed up with being asked to be engaged with about new technologies that they've never heard of before. You know, most people have got better things to do with their lives. And you've got labile public engagement. So the more upstream you are, the further it is before the product gets developed. And you're asking people to say now what they will think about a product that won't actually be on the marketplace for 15 years' time, and you can be quite sure they'll change their minds in 15 years. You know, so you're not actually delivering a useful, viable public perspective on the product you're eventually going to have in the marketplace. So these were the reasons for my initial nervousness about this exercise, but I must admit I was pleasantly surprised. This is the TSB's rationale for setting up this process in the first place. And I think it became clear that one of the aspects of stratified medicine was that it's not that upstream. It's downstream enough for us to have something concrete to talk to the public about. So we can actually engage with members of the public and patient groups and others around issues which they will understand because some of them will have relatives or they'll have diseases themselves. that they will be able to relate this to. So you're not so far upstream that people have nothing in their day-to-day experience that they can hang the dialogue or engagement onto. So how do we understand public perception as the people who are developing the technology? So how do we encourage input, collaboration? How do we make sure people trust? People have already mentioned these things. The bottom 3 points are really important. How do we prevent Frankenfood scenario? That's the GM debate. Postcode lottery scenario, Big Brother scenario. Actually, I'll keep mentioning this. It's important that you don't talk about those things in the same breath as stratified medicine, because the outcome of this dialogue that we did shows that the public are not in that kind of camp when it comes to stratified medicine. They're not going to be ideologically opposed to stratified medicine. That was one of the really interesting things that came out of the engagement exercise. And if they're not going to be ideologically involved, then you're in a very different debate situation from what you are with GM crops and so on. So mentioning them in the same breath actually begins to reinforce the public perception in a way that it's not currently engaged and in a way that will push it in that direction. So I would say a big lesson to come out of this is don't mention them together. So they set up the dialogue. Excuse me, I've got this bug that's going around, so I'm hoping my voice is going to last. They set up the engagement involving ScienceWise. ScienceWise is an excellent body that oversees a lot of the public consultations and dialogues that are conducted in the science area, and they're very, very good at making sure that it's done in a fair way and it's not biased. They wanted to discover, these are the factors that the TSB was interested in. Which approaches, concepts and words and ideas will best convey what stratified medicine involves, things that are likely to cause confusion and misinterpretation and misunderstanding, how to develop your dialogue further with the public. What are the public attitudes and how can they take account of reasonable public concerns about these things. Involving members of the public in developing an ethical framework, practical approaches to the consent for trials, building patient confidence, and exploring the potential health education needed for the public. So they were being very careful to say we want to know how to take this interesting, potentially really beneficial new technology out into the public domain with patients, while having to very carefully avoid the challenge of being told that you're just trying to soften up the market for the companies. And that's something that you always have to bear in mind when you're doing a public dialogue where there are a lot of people who are aware of the tendency of government to try and use public dialogue as a marketing tool for the technology. And not going so far as that, but yet retaining some level of understanding of the kinds of things you need to understand from the public in order to enable the technology to happen. It's a difficult line to tread sometimes. And when you're on an advisory committee with a lot of different interests and perspectives involved in that advisory committee, you're going to get these kinds of questions being asked. So that the purpose, reflecting the previous slide, the purpose was to discover the diversity of the public opinion, which terms are less likely to cause confusion, etc., to explore the possibilities of stratified medicine in a way that enables patients to identify advantages and disadvantages as they see them, to identify what steps will have to be taken to communicate with the public the complex information, and we've already heard this morning about how complex it is overall for the people who are working in the area, even to come to terms with what's involved, and then to establish what sort of ethical framework and practical approaches will build patient and public confidence. The people who were tasked with doing this dialogue were the OPM group, and I was extremely impressed about the very careful way they adopted a process that was completely impartial and not kind of pushing the technology in any particular direction. And this is probably advice I shouldn't give, but I will just the same. If you want somebody to do one of these public dialogues for you, for goodness sake, don't ask academics to do it. Because they have nearly always got an academic theory that they're trying to prove. And it's very difficult for them not to be influenced by that. And it can seriously disrupt what the funders of the dialogue want to achieve from the dialogue. And I would say this group was totally uncontaminated by any such biases and perspectives. They took on board all the advice that they got from the advisory committee, including things like, don't treat this as an attempt to try and reach a consensus among the participants in your dialogue. It's much more useful to explore the diversity of opinion out there and understand the diversity of opinions that you're going to have to deal with when you come to develop a new technology. So not seeking consensus is an important part of it, but also getting a diverse range of opinions. So make sure, yes, you have members of the public who've never actually thought about stratified medicine before and don't even know what it is at the beginning of the dialogue, but also bring in people who do know what it is. So they included medical students and they included patient groups. And actually in the, I was the observer on one of the dialogues that took place in Glasgow, and it was quite interesting how many of the members of the public who were involved in that, who, even though they'd never heard of stratified medicine, had themselves or had relatives who had diseases that would be helped by stratified medicine. So they were able to engage with it quite quickly, and that really helped that engagement process. They used a broad range of tools to get information across to the people who'd never thought about stratified medicine before. So that's important, is how you give people the very first information they've ever had about a new technology. That's very important in framing that technology in their minds, and they will go ahead and spread that news to other people, and that framing of the technology will become widely available publicly through the media these days, the internet media, and so on. It's really important. Video testimonies, scenarios, animation, discussions. The stakeholder workshops, the public dialogue workshops that were carried out in 4 different locations throughout the UK took place in 2 stages. And the first stage in each location had a group of people who were academics, practitioners working in this area, who were there just as an information source. So they were there for the people working on the dialogue to get information on how the technology was being developed. And they were expert sources of information that were there to be tapped, and that worked really well. I'm going to skip quite quickly over the outcomes and just emphasize the really important ones, but I've given on this set of slides the websites where you can get to the actual report of the dialogue, and I recommend you read it. The first bullet there is quite interesting. Too many different terms being used for the same thing. We've heard that this morning. They didn't like stratified medicine because it sounded elitist. Well, elitist in one way, it sounded as if you're trying to pick the best, in some way, and that was giving it a slightly negative connotation. It was also quite quickly translated over to ethnic strata. So is this a way of picking Caucasian types rather than other types to give the drugs to? Or if it's there's been a big discussion in America over some of this, where there was a lot of fears that it was discriminating against black people in America, and that raised quite a negative impression about some aspects of stratified medicine in the States. The concept was seen as easily understood. It wasn't difficult to get the concept across to people. You need to be realistic in terms of the pros and cons, and also I would say the time scale, because we're talking today to these people in dialogue and also in other communications about something that, to be realistic, is going to take at least 10 years before it's available to many people in the UK. And you need to be realistic about that. You need to let people know this is going to take a long time, and there are going to be lots of failures on the way. and communicate through trusted channels is another important aspect. Somebody said in one of the dialogues, people don't need to know why they're getting a drug, just to be confident in what they're getting. But on the other hand, somebody else said most people want shared responsibility in decision making, so they want to be part of the decision. But some patients will really struggle with choice. So these are some of the dilemmas that came through in the discussions. So that led to, the need for counselling and palliative care for patients, and also needing for training for doctors and nurses to deal with these dilemmas that the patients will be facing when they're part of this process. There were social equity concerns. You need to be upfront about the reasons for exclusion from treatment. The people were worried that factors other than test results might drive decisions, and it's going to be expensive. So if we're realistic, maybe there will be cost factors driving decisions about care as well as the diagnostic factors. There was some nervousness about the public, about the private sector involvement, mainly drug companies. We've got an interesting pathology in the UK and Europe, a social pathology. An awful lot of people think it's a really bad idea if anybody makes money out of publicly funded research. We've really got to tackle that public perception somehow, because nothing is going to happen if somebody can't make money out of it. And I think that's what's underlying that aspect. But interestingly, the notion of profit coming into it was much less of a problem for younger people, so maybe that's a good sign. Most people were comfortable with data sharing. In the Glasgow group that I was in, people were much more concerned about sharing their bank account details than they were about sharing their genomes. It's okay, you can have my genes, it's not as if it's my bank account, That was interesting. And there was also a concern about the media and media manufacturing scare stories around patients that don't qualify for treatment. And we saw that happening quite a bit in the Herceptin case a good few years ago now. I think the possibility of that is still there. We really need to educate the press. And I think it would be a good idea to involve the Science Media Centre in thinking about how they can help the area of stratified medicine to actually engage better with the public and so on, and with the press. The press is really important here. So questions then going forward, following up from the dialogue exercise, what should happen now? And for industry, they want to promote broader awareness. How do they do that? They need an industry-wide approach, pre-competitive consortia with trade associations, patient groups. We've heard already that that's beginning to happen. I think it's got to be communicated better that it's happening more widely in the society. Ensure that life science students are aware with inclusion of the technology and how it's developing, include it in core courses, work with relevant societies. With that in mind, the Scottish Funding Council's funding as part of its Stratified Medicine Innovation Centre in Scotland, a master's programme on stratified medicine, and the Imogen Institute has a one module on that to train those students on the aspects of making innovation happen that we deal with. The NHS, medical practitioners, so ensuring that clinicians and nursing staff are aware of the developments. This is all fairly standard stuff. Patient groups and charities, educating patients in your areas, with government needing to work out how to drive widespread adoption, incentivising new technology uptake. I think a lot of these things are already happening. I think maybe where there's still more work to be done is in joining them up, because they need all to work together in ways that are coordinated and integrated. And this is me now coming back to this wider context. And this is a table that I developed in the 1980s to describe what was happening with GM crops dialogue. And bit of the table on the right-hand side, ideology-based conflicts, where you're dealing with hearts, not minds, that was what I was using to describe what's happening with GM crops. So it's organised internationally. You get very difficult to resolve problems because any information is treated as propaganda. Compensation might be treated as bribery, negotiations treated as betrayal. You cannot resolve it by any of these standard means. If you give concessions, you get escalation of demands, and protagonists are looking to recruit supporters to a higher level cause. In the case of GM crops, the anti-globalization agenda. And so that was hugely ideology-based, very political, and very, very difficult to deal with. And on the left-hand side, you've got interest-based conflicts, where you're dealing with minds, you're dealing with a rational approach to what's good for me. Will I like it? Won't I like it? You can resolve dilemmas by giving information. People will take an unbiased approach to the information they're given. On the right-hand side of that table, if you give people information, they're going to look at it and see, does it agree with my cause? If it doesn't agree with my cause, I will ignore it. If it does agree with my cause, I will ramp it up. And on the other side, people will look at information and they will treat it rationally. If you're on the left-hand side, you're in a much easier negotiating position. And I would say, from the dialogue that we've just seen the results of, stratified medicine is on the left-hand side of that table. And it's really important that you don't do anything that will push it over to the right-hand side. And so that uncommitted 60% of the population who are in the middle of that table are not going to be easily swayed over to the right-hand side, as happened with GM crops. They're going to be pulled much more in the to the left-hand side direction. And I think that's very positive for stratified medicine, or maybe we should start calling it precision medicine, because I do think that's the word that has the least negative connotations in the general public and the most positive ones. And I think if you're choosing a name just because of how it plays in the general public, I would say precision medicine is the best of the ones that are out there at the moment. I think we've developed this approach to constructive stakeholder engagement and how you do it. That's very much based on our experience with GM crops. And I think a lot of these aspects are not as challenging for stratified medicine as they have been for GM crops. But you need to be equitably skeptical about the motivations of the people you engage with, even in this area. So if you're engaging with industry and you're getting industry perspective on something, you have to bear in mind that companies are influenced by their agenda, researchers are influenced by their agenda, regulators are influenced by a different agenda altogether. And they will all come to something from very different perspectives, and you really have to, and the public is somewhere in the middle of that milieu, and are being influenced by statements from all of these people. And that's a really difficult process to manage, this business of being equitably skeptical. You know, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? Why are they saying it? You know, that kind of thing. Always bear that in mind. We don't just need to engage about the science and technology. We need to let people know the difficulties of doing innovation. It's really hard. It's far harder than doing the scientific research. You know, the researchers think they're kind of the top dogs in terms of intellectual contribution, but actually it's far harder to make the innovation happen, and it's a much more complex process. And the regulatory processes, most people who come to a dialogue about innovative technology could go away with the impression that these guys could do whatever they liked and nobody's going to stop them. So they have to also understand that there is an enormous body of regulation out there already. And the key question is, which bit of the regulatory system will you choose to apply to your technology? Because the bit of the regulatory system you choose to apply could kill that technology stone dead. And we're already suffering from the implications of the decision to treat regenerative medicine as if it was a drug. That's causing enormous problems for the development of that technology. We need to develop standards for engagement. I think it's an important aspect. I think, as I said, OPM did a fantastic job. They complied with all the standards I would have seen as being relevant. in a plural democracy, it's important to maintain choice as far as possible, so you shouldn't use a dialogue or an engagement exercise as a way of closing off opportunities for a particular technology to reach a marketplace. That should not be part of the agenda. And the EPSRC made an unfortunate decision after they'd done a public dialogue on nanotechnology not to include theranostics in their next call for research projects. And that was influenced by that public dialogue and the outcomes of it, and that was widely criticised, and I don't think they're implementing that strategy anymore. But you know, definitely don't use the outcomes of a dialogue to close off particular areas of technology. You need to have open discussions, make sure no perspective dominates other opinions, manage expectations. So if you're looking for a broad variety of opinions, don't give your participants in a dialogue the expectation that you will take action based on the outcomes of that dialogue, because the outcomes will have different meanings and different impacts for different bits of your community of people you're dialoguing with, and you can't meet all these expectations at once with one outcome. Careful timing is important, and I think the timing of the Stratified Medicine dialogue was excellent. If you do it too early, its value will be undermined by the uncertainty around what future developments are, and if it's too late, then stakeholder opinions will have kind of ossified already, and you may not actually be able to accommodate the different opinions that are out there. So I think the timing of Stratified Medicine one was spot on. It was just as it's beginning to reach a phase of major ramp up for the support for that particular set of technologies in the UK. And so we're going to be hearing more about it in various media. It's really important that the value of that dialogue is not lost, and that everybody in this room and others read it in full and make sure you take it on board in your wider communications. So don't perpetuate the myths that, you know, the public might decide that synthetic biology is going to be a bad thing, and how do we stop them moving in that direction. Don't even suggest that, because that's not there in the public mind at the moment. And if it's not there, then for goodness sake, don't put it there. And you have to think about the media campaigns that might result from any particular statement in any particular context. You know, manage expectations very carefully. I haven't put it on here, but there's a rather good set of brief paper describing advice on how to deal with these media scares, how to debunk myths. It's called Debunking Myths. It's from some Australian psychologists, and you'll find it on the web. Very good advice on how to stop these myths becoming widely disseminated, and also how to deal with them once they're out there. So that's important. How am I doing for time? 2 minutes, okay. Very quickly, going back to this, I'd just like to situate this in the wider context. So this is our triangle again, with the stakeholders down at the bottom. I want to bring in the governance and the innovators very briefly. This is the approach we've developed in Inogen for looking at these aspects from the point of view of the innovators themselves. So that big green arrow is the kind of linking up of business models from a range of different companies into a value chain that will work. Really important to know who links with whom at what point in developing this value chain. That's really interesting exercise to be done. I don't think there's a body anywhere in charge of doing that kind of thing for the UK, and that would be really helpful to have that as part of the agenda here. And then in the innovation ecosystem, you've got these other aspects. You've got stakeholders, you've got regulation, you've got something up at the top, RRI, that's responsible research and innovation. And that's a big EU agenda for the social sciences at the moment. And the way the EU is doing it is seriously defective. And I'm about to write a paper criticising that. But it's not going to work well for companies, that's for sure. And I think it's something that needs to be tackled. And I don't want you to read this, I'm just bringing it up. The reference is at the bottom, and I gather this is going to go on the website, so you'll be able to get it. This is something we did a couple of years ago on the co-development of diagnostics and drugs for stratified medicine. And that's the co-development where convergence in the regulatory systems for the diagnostics and the drugs has to happen before phase 1-2 clinical trials. And so this came up in some of this morning's discussion. This is a model where co-development convergence happens at phase 3 clinical trials. So you can develop your diagnostic up to the point where it comes in at phase 3 without having this lengthy regulatory system being applied to the diagnostics tools developers. This is the paper that this is on. Was for a while it was the 4th most tweeted paper on Elsevier's website. So I think it maybe had some influence, but I never actually looked at the tweets, so I don't know whether they were positive or negative. What it was showing was that this co-development at the early stages, which is the way the regulatory system is going to make it very, very difficult for any small company to develop a diagnostic device without doing it through a multinational company. And actually, in the end of the day, it will probably mean that the only people who will develop these diagnostic tools will be the big multinational companies. And taking that into our broader understanding of research processes, the more big multinational companies are involved in an innovation trajectory, the less radical innovation you will get. More of the innovation will be incremental. And I think that's a challenge for the precision medicine, stratified medicine industry, making sure that, that you don't stifle radical innovation in diagnostics development by the way you're developing the regulatory system. I think we need to find ways to enable small companies to develop things without having to constantly look over their shoulders to, so what will I be able to sell to a multinational company at the end of the day? And that's a big challenge for precision medicine, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got time for a couple of questions, some very important points there. Mark.
Hi there. It's Mark Bartlett from a startup company called Genome, personalised medicine. Is the mic working? Hello? Yeah. I just had a question about Big Pharma. So as you were saying before, alluding to, they have quite a bad press, bad PR. People don't like to see industry getting involved with this subject. So do you think there is a role for Big Pharma, other than just funding small initiatives? And also, is their brand a little bit too muddied from past experiences?
Yeah. Yes, I think so. I think there has to be. You know, if it's going to happen, there has to be a role for Big Pharma. I said provocatively in a scenario report we did for OECD a few years ago that the starting point for our scenario was Big Pharma's dead on its feet, why is it still standing? And we concluded that the reason it was still standing was the regulatory system, which prevents any effective competition from small companies that might change the whole innovation trajectory. So we're stuck with Big Pharma. I think what we have to do is try and help it to work better. And I think there is an important PR job to be done there. I think they're aware of it now, and they're working on it. And what they're doing in Ebola, for example, I think is going to change the public perception of big drug companies. They're doing a lot of work with the Gates Foundation in developing drugs for developing countries. So I think Big Pharma is aware of the need to change its image. I think it's working on it. I think it finds it very difficult because they do actually have to change their innovation models in really radical ways if they're actually going to be able to survive. You know, they're now aware that the regulatory systems have become so onerous that even Big Pharma can't operate within the regulatory system as it is at the moment. And we've just finished a project on how you could support Big Pharma in developing new antimicrobial drugs. And one of the conclusions from that was that the regulatory system in that area has been adapted very considerably in the last 4 or 5 years, to the extent that it brought down the cost of developing a new antibiotic by 50%, just by changing the guidelines for doing the clinical trials. So there are things that regulators can do that will seriously speed up developments, which will enable Big Pharma to be more innovative, I think. So I think there are a lot of hopeful signs on the horizon.
Thank you very much for that. Any more questions? Can I just ask, what did the public actually want in terms of terminology? You said precision medicine. We
Yeah.
call it stratified medicine. What term did they come up with?
Well, they didn't like personalised medicine because they saw, once they had an explanation of what stratified medicine was, they realised it's not personalised, it's not down to that level of precision. Stratified medicine, as I said, had an element of the wrong kind of stratification attached to it. And we didn't actually, in the dialogue, explore what else you might call it that they would accept. But my personal feeling is precision medicine doesn't at least carry that kind of baggage. And it's worth thinking further about whether there's anything else we haven't thought about around precision medicine that would give the wrong kinds of message. But yeah.
And there is literature about people criticizing the term precision medicine out there now as well.
Okay.
I guess we'll only succeed when we call it medicine, right?
Yes.
Gordon.
Thank you. I am Gordon Duff. Thanks. I thank you for a very interesting talk. I thought it was beautifully given as well. I just began to develop a slight, not even a concern, but the glimmer of hello. Are we pitching this as a form of medicine in which there are winners and losers? Because I've heard a couple of phrases this morning, like somebody said, I failed the test.
Yes.
And I think you had something said, people who do not qualify for the medicine.
Yes.
Now, my view of it is that there are no losers.
Yeah.
And ultimately, everybody wins.
Yeah.
And I'm just slightly concerned that even unconsciously, when we're talking to people, that thought is in our minds.
Yeah. I think one of the things we don't emphasise nearly enough in this area is the ability to prevent adverse drug reactions and so on. I think if we emphasised that more,
Exactly.
we would actually
Yes.
deliver a different message to the public.
I think so.
But I think also, emphasising that this is a long-term trajectory and we may not yet have a test that will enable us to treat you in the same way, but we're working on it, and the data you have given us as part of this process will help us to develop tests that will deal with your particular kind of treatment and so on. So I think there are ways of putting it positively, and I think we could work hard on those. Yeah.
For having said that, you're my friend forever. Because I come from the science. Thank you very much.